Okay, thanks for coming in to this session. Small change to the advertised programme. Amanda was unable to make it, unfortunately, today, last minute emergency. We were very happy and lucky that Ben was here, and if you were here this morning, you know he's a man of opinion. And so I'm sure we'll have plenty to add into this panel discussion on the Internet of Things. I was asked in a break, well, what is this Internet of Things? Everything's supposed to be simple. It's supposed to have three things only. That's the McKinsey way of describing things. So the Internet of Things is about sensors, actuation, and joining them together on the Internet. That's what we're going to be talking about. You can disagree with me because I'm not going to speak anymore on this subject. We're going to talk about that and its relationship with market research. And we're very, very lucky to have three great people on the panel. I already introduced Ben from Instantly. We're also joined by Simon Rice from the Information Commissioner's Office. I'm not going to say he's voicing the legal side of this, but he is here to talk about the protection, I think, of consumer rights. And then from the corporate side, great to have Hamza with us as well from Reckitt Benckiser, or RB, which is a lot easier to say. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, then we're going to throw it open to the floor and let's see where it goes. So I think the big question, guys, is why are we here today? Why are we talking about the Internet of Things now and at this conference? Who'd like to start? Hamza?
Hello. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. I think from my perspective, I think we're definitely at the kind of at the tipping point. I think we've got to a place where connectivity is all around us, and technology is taking a form whereby it's becoming so advanced that we're actually struggling to know what to do with it. And all the data that's kind of beginning to capture is quite intimidating. So I think we're at the point now where advancements are continuing to kind of evolve and become more rapid. So I think it's a case of trying to understand from a research perspective and just as a person, what do we do with this new wave of information that big data and the Internet of Things does have and does capture. And it's very much about how we can use that information to, best kind of live our lives, become better people, and also ultimately, from my perspective, how can we grow the business? So I think we're at that point now where it can go either way. I'm still not convinced that we've got kind of control of where we are at the moment.
Thanks very much. For me, I think the Internet of Things represents a whole host of sort of new data sets that I think can be collected. Data can be collected for and processed. And I think certainly if you're collecting that type of data already, not from the Internet of Things, you might just think, oh, it's just a sensor, it's fine, it's not personal data. But certainly when we get into the Internet of Things, start combining it, especially with smartphones or home networks, then it really does open up that potential for it to be personal data. And then, of course, all those legal obligations then come in as well.
Yeah, my view on it is not big data so much as Big Brother. And I did an article in the Times, the Polite article a couple of weeks ago about Big Brother, and the fact that we are starting to know more and more about people, and this is one other element of knowing more about people. So why wouldn't I want to do a survey to somebody about washing powder when I know that they've just put the washing machine on? Or I want to talk about content that they might watch on TV. Well, let's send them that survey when they turn the TV on. That starts to become really Big Brother stuff. So that's when you start to get into PII, because you start to get down to an individual level of what an individual is doing. Now, as an individual, actually that might make more sense. Great, you're going to send me a survey now, in context, while I'm actually engaged in what it is that you're wanting to talk to me about. So I think there's a big benefit to market research by pulling this Big Brother approach together. But I do see the pitfalls of PII at the same time.
Yeah, it's interesting that you use the phrase Big Brother, and Hamza, so about the excitement that you can feel about the freedom and the new ways that things can be done, and the things that could happen. I mean, Ben's already alluded to a sort of an idea for market research that can kick off out of all of this. Are there risks to any of this? Is there any reason why any of this Internet of Things and market research coming along together may not happen? I mean, can we take advantage of it?
I think the biggest risk is the biggest advantage too is the big brother effect. So go back to my analogy of, okay, I want to survey Ben when he puts the washing machine on. Well, if that washing machine hasn't been turned on for 2 weeks, I'm probably abroad on holiday. Now, if somebody can hack my PII, which is reasonably easy to do, supposedly, with these networks, they're fairly open, it's pretty easy then to say, okay, Ben's on holiday, there's a window, I'm in. So that's my biggest concern, is that we start to understand a little bit too much about my day. We know when I've used my credit card to get on the train, to go to work. We know which car I'm driving, where I'm driving it to, how long I've been there. We start to know too much about me potentially, so we have to be really careful about how we handle that data.
Yeah, I do think it's becoming a place of information overload, and I keep coming back to that fact. Kind of inundated with information at present, and I think the more that we continue to collect information from various sensors and different touch points, I think the more it becomes a fact of, it's actually quite creepy to a certain extent. You kind of know what people are doing at every moment of every day. And I think to a certain extent, we kind of already know that now. I think we're getting to that point where actually you can quite accurately track behavior. And speaking from my perspective and the work that I've been doing, I can quite accurately tell someone's washing cycle and exactly how they're doing things in every minute detail. But I think it gets to a further point, whereas is there a kind of a boundary that you're crossing in the fact that you're collecting information without people's knowledge, and that's dangerous. And that's where we get into kind of a really kind of, intimidating and quite scary territory, I think.
I think so. I'm sure Simon would love to pick up on that precise
Yeah,
phrase.
I think they're sort of the two key points that have come out quite well. First of all, the security side of things. We could look at the media from the last even 2 months, even not the last 2 years, of enough stories about insecure products out there on the web. And as well as the transparency and information to individuals. Ultimately, you've got these devices in people's homes, and they're using these. They've gone out and spent their hard-earned cash. Taking that user-generated data without their knowledge and without their understanding and consent, if that's necessary, is really going very close towards that big brother, creepiness factor. And you ask, can you get it wrong? Yes, there is potential to get it spectacularly wrong. The first thing people would do is switch these things off. Ultimately, where does that leave you with access to that data?
As market researchers, I think in the room we would like to think of ourselves as not having bad intent towards people who would give us as information. Does that cover us enough, Simon, I think?
I wouldn't say it's a get out of jail free card at all. Just because you're good intentions, you can still do bad things, and people don't like it. There is no exemption in the Data Protection Act that says, I didn't mean any harm.
I think as well. I think often we think, and obviously being in the corporate world, you often think about how it can impact, business and research, but actually to humanity, I think there's a far greater benefit that this may eventually have. So I think when you start thinking about healthcare, when you start thinking about manufacturing, and you start thinking about things that actually can use big data, Internet of Things in a way that is actually beneficial to humanity and society, I think that's where it gets quite powerful. So, the idea that you can fit sensors into a bridge and try and understand, when's the tipping point, when will it collapse, or you can predict earthquakes in a much more timely manner, or, a healthcare professional might be able to, communicate with his patient while he's not even in the room and monitor his heart rate and sensors. I think that's, for me, the most exciting aspect. So I think there's a huge excitement factor to it. I just think it just depends on how we as individuals and in research and people who are the decision makers, how it's chosen to be used. And that will, of course, be different depending on the context.
Okay. So,
In my experience, market research likes to draw the line. So we like to think we're kind of slightly above the generic marketers who want to use this for slightly more unscrupulous means. I don't think respondents necessarily get the difference. So to a respondent, a person, a human, are we, being holier than thou and asking them a question for market research purposes, or are we advertising to them? And I think they don't necessarily get the difference, which is why the onus is on us to make sure not only are we doing the right things in that protection, but we're also that educational side to the respondent to make sure that they understand what we're trying to drive at and why we're not going to abuse their information and why we're not going to market to them necessarily.
okay. Interesting point. I was going to say, let's throw it open to the floor. A hand came up immediately.
Joris from ISIN. I was wondering, this is kind of philosophical, and we direct my question directly to Hamza, as he's the only client at the table there. Do you use at this point this possibility? Are there some really crazy projects where you can tell us something about it?
I think
Give us some enlightenment, what it
yeah, sure. I mean, I mean, I can't speak on behalf of our beefs. I'm not sure what's happening, but from my side and my experience so far, the answer would be no. I think various approaches like mobile ethnographies and things like that, where you get that's the closest that I've come so far, and obviously going in home and obviously observing people through their mobile phone. That's what we have been doing, but that's always at the kind of it's been consented to, in a sense. It's not like we're tracking information through different devices and we're gathering that information. Where actually you very much have that consent, and I think that's the kind of boundary for me. It's where we're collecting that metadata and that information from sensors and other places, from other devices. That's not something that I've tapped into yet, no.
Yes, please.
Alex Johnson from Kantar. Who's going to own all this data?
I'll take it.
Take the washing machine example. If I want to do that piece of research, where am I going to get that piece of information from? Because I'm not going to install an app on the washing machine. Is it going to be Indesit, BT broadband? Is Apple going to take over the connected home? How have a view?
I have a personal view. I think that there will be businesses that will try and own this space. You just mentioned a couple of them, Apple and BT. I think BT have a reasonably vested interest in the UK, certainly, at becoming that connective tissue. Okay, they almost want to see themselves as the digital plumber that provides the telephony, the broadband, the TV content. I think they will try and take this space. So I think yes, I think we'll end up renting or buying that data from companies like BT, Apple, Google, whoever wants to play in that space. I think that's how it'll happen.
I think whether of ownership of data is probably not a very useful structure to be looking at. I mean, certainly, again, answering your question of can you install an app on a washing machine, yes, you probably will be able to. Or if not on a washing machine, on a mobile phone that connects to a washing machine or some kind of hub. Certainly, again, talking about the ownership, it's probably it's better to go back and look at the legislation saying, do you have the right to be processing that data? Do you have the right permissions either from the user? Has been set up in the right way? And does everyone know what's going on?
If we go back to that first question as well, I think that the other point you were making was, does this thing exist here and now today, or are we talking about something that will exist in the future? An Internet of Things.
I think the gold standard of the Internet of Things doesn't exist yet. The technology's there, but certainly the sensors are there, and there is capability to tie into some of those sensors, and that might be with the proprietary products, whether that be a sort of a Fitbit or a heart rate sensor or something like that, or a camera in the home. So there's certainly the beginnings of it there, and certainly the smartphone or the wireless hubs give access to those connected devices.
I think it does. I think it definitely does exist as well. In you think about registration, kind of pickup automatic machines, which are recognition plates. They know which car it is. They know how fast you're going. It's almost like an automatic GPS that everyone seems to have. And there's also the kind of the smart city in Korea, which has already kind of popped up, which seems to have been huge investment behind, where every device and everything seems to be connected to each other. So there are advancements being made. I think the utilization of the information, I think, hasn't kind of progressed, definitely from a corporate perspective. I don't think we've actually understood what to do with it yet. I still think we're trying to figure out the basics, and this is something much more on top and trying to understand how can we distill this information and make it into something actionable.
I think it's really, really interesting that you pick up on a couple of real-life examples where this thing is really working, because it's so much of technology and progress and change sneaks up on us, without us really knowing. And we think about the Internet of Things perhaps as being the fridge that orders the milk or something outlandish, but the reality is it's a lot more mundane than that. And the question, I think, comes back for this audience perhaps in market research: will we be late to the party, or will we be ahead of the curve? What do we think?
You're going to hate me for saying this. I think we'll be late.
Well, I think we'll be late as well.
I think, but for good reasons. I think the market research industry is usually quite reticent to try new things and wants to make sure that when we do new things, we do them correctly. I think other industries are maybe a little bit faster off the mark and maybe a little more gung-ho, dare I say. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think our profession is about us being respectful and accurate. That said, there is an opportunity, I think, to maybe get ahead of the curve and think about what may come in 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, I think it's definitely the case. I do think we're a little bit slow. I think to your point, I think it's for good reason. I still think there's the capability gap, I have to say. I still think that there are so many things developing so quickly to stay on top of absolutely every different aspect of, what data is actually captured. It's a huge task, and I think it requires significant test and learn and experimentation. And I think until we really start thinking, okay, we're going to experiment with something brand new, first of all, there's major resistance from marketing, from a corporate standpoint, purely because it's something new, it's not tried and tested. You have to go somewhere which you've never been before, and there's obviously the fear of the unknown. I've got too much information, what do I do with this? And it's I think from a corporate standpoint, it's very much about we need to really understand what it means and how we can apply that information to the best use.
I think that's a really good point too for us. The market research industry is slightly lower down the food chain. So what will happen is that, at corporate level, it will be let's invest in something new if we can see some light at the end of the tunnel, we can see revenue from it. It's much harder for you to make that case around insight. That comes down the chain. So if you can't make that case upwards, we can't make that case to you. So I think there's a part of that chain effect as well. That we how do we break out of that as market researchers? Do we take it on the chin ourselves? Do we decide to invest and go with a solution and go with some answers? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. But I think that chain effect also hinders us.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I think as well, it's all about storytelling, and especially in a corporate mindset. I think the more data points that you have, I think often we're really pleased and it's a really positive thing. But actually, when it comes down to reality, it's about the ROI, and it's about if we are going to invest in something, then it needs to be very, very tangible what that means to my business and what it's going to mean. I think in other sectors, I think there's huge opportunity for us I think it's already being used. You can start seeing it being used in the medical profession in other places. But I think when it comes to a business context and a corporate context, I still think there's a long way to go.
Okay. Please, Simon.
This hinges, Simon for Cooper, this hinges a bit on this topic, but there's the technological ecosystem is fast evolving, and thank you. The technological ecosystem is fast evolving, and then there are the privacy guidelines, like the Data Protection Act, that are always slow to catch up. And then there's the market research interpretation of these guidelines. So what's the best way to approach this, and how can we make sure that we're always as compliant as we can be and make sure that we're on the safe side? Because it's difficult.
So why are you slow, Simon?
That sounds like a question for me, doesn't it? I think the best way to be compliant, always treat it as personal data, even if there's any doubt. That would always be, put you in good stead. Look at that certainly in terms of user-generated data. If you're looking at MAC addresses from mobile phones or some unique identifier on the device, you could take the argument and say, well, it refers to that device, it can't be personal. Or you could take the idea that actually that device is always associated with that individual because it's always in their pocket. When we see that device comes back, we're going to be 99% sure it's the same person. And you could take the opportunity to say, well, we will treat it as personal data, and then put the necessary controls in place and think, well, no, we do need to inform that person that this technology is operating in this store or in this public area, public space. That would never be a bad thing, to give people too much information to get better engagement. We've heard today, if people are more involved, you might get better data as well. So really, it's a win-win. You get better data, more engaged customers, people are more informed, people are happier.
Wally.
Wally O'Malley, excuse me, sorry. Wally O'Malley from Confirmit. Lots of challenges to the process of managing big data, but are there any sort of examples of companies out there that you're aware of that are doing a good job in this area, that are extracting good ROI from, whether it's experimental studies or actually, practical live cases of utilizing big data in their organizations?
I was just reading the other day about P&G. I wouldn't say it's necessarily driven by ROI, but I think there's an example of P&G with a soap dispenser in the Philippines, whereby we're looking at hygiene and looking at kind of ensuring that there's a safety standard and that people are always looking after their hands, they're washing their hands in the right way. So when they were leaving, public toilet cubicles, I believe, they installed these soap dispensers, and there was a sensor on that to see whether it had been used or not. So if you walked out the door and you didn't, it automatically an alarm started ringing, saying, okay, you need to go back and you need to do it. So it flagged it. So it was just an example of where you can start to see where the technology, in a sense, and that would immediately be transmitted to P&G, I believe, or a different company, which would collect that data and assess the level of, are there more people beginning to wash their hands in the way they're meant to, or is that decreasing, for example? So I know that's an example of where it's started to happen. There's also another example around, I think, forget which car manufacturer it is, but there is an example of, to combat theft in cars, whereby there is going to be a system whereby every time you kind of go and try and sit in your vehicle, there's a automatic face recognition software automatically installed within the car. So if it doesn't recognize your face for whatever reason, it automatically sends a picture of that person's face to your device, and it also notifies the company, the car alarm company. So it's trying to just, they are beginning to see a thread, and where people are beginning to work on these kind of innovations. But I think when it comes back to ROI, I think that's the golden question. I mean, I'm not clear yet in terms of whether that transforms to that. But you can begin to see the seed which is being planted, and then it's becoming more and more kind of regular from my side.
If we're talking about big data rather than Internet of Things, I think the industry that's probably furthest ahead is the advertising industry. And I think most people here probably are aware of the term programmatic, which is a relatively new term, and even now in market research doesn't really exist. I suspect it may soon. Programmatic is essentially using big data, algorithm, segmentation, behavioural science to better target ads at people. So I think the ad industry has started to get their head around use of big data better than anybody else.
Yeah, and I think you look at companies like Netflix, Amazon, it's all algorithm driven now, and I think they're becoming so much more advanced. And I think that's kind of taken, there's a direct return, there's so much intellectual kind of work going on behind the scenes to really ensure that these algorithms, they're using the data, they're using behavior, real behavior, to drive, pushing out the right content and kind of pushing out the product that is most receptive to you at that period of time. So there are definitely seeds, I think, which are happening at the moment.
So certainly from my perspective, I think obviously I have a biased sample, so I probably only see the people getting it wrong rather than people doing it better. But I will openly admit it's a biased sample to start with. But I think it's not necessarily maybe getting better answers to existing questions. It's different answers to different questions is what maybe big data will enable you to look at. Maybe things are questions you couldn't answer beforehand, especially when we start to look at things like connected cities or smart cities. Some examples, we calculate or count the number of people coming out of an underground and then feed that into the traffic lights to turn that green, or to have better connected flows of traffic. I think there's a study in Denmark where it changes the traffic lights of the cycle lanes as more cyclists come through. And again, enabling different things to happen that you couldn't do, perhaps without that big data or that analysis.
I think that point's very interesting, because if we're thinking about manipulating the environment in which consumer decision-making is taking place, that has a massive knock-on effect for market research when we go and then ask somebody, what did you do? When we have no idea of the context and the environment under which that decision was taken, which almost demands that we have access to sensor data, a Netflix or something like that, if that's what drove the consumer. Can we avoid it? Who knows?
I think
we'll call that a hanging question, if you like.
A better question is, should we avoid it? I don't think we should try and avoid it. I think it's going to be an integral part of life. And I think that if we try and distance ourselves from it, we potentially distance ourselves from the mainstream world that we work in.
Question, yeah. Oh, sorry, yes.
Hi, Naomi from Philbox. It's jumping backwards a little bit, but you mentioned You mentioned manufacturers allowing access to MR agencies to install product applications. What about when research isn't commissioned by them? Is this not going to become very one-sided, customer research only, or what's your thoughts on that? Might be
So
for
we're talking about
Hamza.
the difference, I suppose, between an independent access to a sample and a closed access to
So looking at customer sample only versus competitor sample with alongside your customer sample, basically.
one imagines it would be hard to hack into. And before I get arrested for saying the idea of hacking into.
I think you mentioned MR agencies. Someone mentioned MR agencies being able to purchase access to these applications. Can you really see that happening, or do you think they'll only be given access when the commissioning client is that manufacturer?
I should imagine there's permission issues.
I mean, I think certainly the way it seems to be going at the moment, there is not interoperability between the systems. So if you've got an Internet of Things from Apple, it won't interact with an Internet of Things from Google and from Samsung and so on. The great benefit of the Internet of Things is when we get that interoperability. From a technical viewpoint, we want things to speak to each other, which would certainly enable that direct access to the consumer. Quite whether it happens or not really remains to be seen. But I guess it's not too dissimilar to the smartphone app market at the moment in some instances.
It's also not too dissimilar to the question about the concept of ownership, however you want to describe it. Yeah?
That's exactly what I was going to say. If I am BT and what I've done is I've connected these different internets of things together, and then I'm the one that's gathered permission from that user that I can access that data. That permission is, in theory, enough for me to then enable you, the market researcher, to use it. So I think it comes back down to who owns that permission data, and I think it will be the same types of companies that figure out how to network it together.
Well, on the premise of the Dahlia scale of how interesting a session has been, I've just been given the 1 minute warning, and I thought we'd been going for about 5 minutes, so we've obviously been running half an hour. So I want to leave with one final question. We've talked about some upsides, some downsides, some really interesting applications about whether we can be involved or not. But what excites you, if anything, as we say in research, about the Internet of Things?
Big Brother. It's that all-seeing, all-knowing ability to know everything about everybody all the time. I think as researchers, we're always curious. We always want to know the most that we can possibly know about everybody. And that's dangerous, but I also think it's very exciting, and it's a great opportunity for us.
I think what excites me, I'm a technologist, so from my smartphone I can switch on my lights, I can switch on my central heating, I can water my plants, and all sorts of weird and wonderful things. I can see a lot of people in the audience going, well, why'd you bother? But that really excites me, and I think, but looking at it, that's a lot of data and a lot of access to certain aspects of my life. So really then, there's a huge amount of potential there for innovation from the types of products, but also innovation from the types of market research that might be done, but also innovation in how you can communicate to the user. We've got a whole load of new services, so let's not just rely on tick boxes for consent. Let's be innovative here as well.
I think from my side, I think it's the fact that, first of all, I don't think we know how big this thing can get and how big, it can continue to spiral and escalate. And, in 10 years' time, we could be having a completely different conversation. I think that there is something really exciting in the fact that, taking it away from the corporate world and everything like that, I think I would say the benefit to humanity is endless because, you think about healthcare and you think about manufacturing, agriculture, things that we've often struggled. It's come down to human error. It's come down to, our precise tracking of certain things that actually, humans will always make mistakes, will always have deficiencies. But actually, this is creating some sort of, you have a fail-safe, you have something which is driven by something empirical, which I think is very exciting. That will mean that the deficiencies that we do see today will kind of gradually start to kind of being shunned out, and we'll become a lot more of a kind of, I guess, prosperous society from that perspective. There'll be a lot less waste. There'll be a lot more kind of, a feeling that we're in control, and in that sense, I think it'll benefit everybody.
Well, that's a very positive note to end on. Thank you so much for being on the panel. Thanks for the questions.